Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody today, Circle members, and also especially to those people joining for the first time. This is our number 97 of our Let's Talk About seminars, which started during COVID. The Circle was founded in 1960 in the UK, and today we have approximately 2,000 members, wine writers, broadcasters, educators, and other professional communicators. And we're based across the world, 50% in the UK and 50% in other countries. There's more information about the Circle that you can find on our website and also about joining. If you're not a member and you'd like to attend more of our and find out about more of our events, then please do let me know and we can add you to our mailing list. And now, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Liz Gabay, who will introduce Liz, our speaker today. Over to you, Liz.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming to this webinar. I don't think Liz really needs any introduction. If you talk about rosé wine, the first person's name outside the producers that comes to mind is Liz. She knows so much about it, particularly from the south of France, but much broader. Her first book on understanding the rosé, understanding the pink wine revolution, appeared in January 2018, and since then, with her son, she's written a second book on rosés of southern France, and together they've also done a massive report for lost it, but anyway, a massive report on more. Thank you. And Liz is involved in all aspects of wine writing, consultancy, all sorts of things. So she really knows so much about rosé wine. And this seminar comes about from a conversation we had at a tasting last autumn, where Liz started to tell me some of the things that were going on in rosé, which I had no idea about. And it was so fascinating. So she's here now to tell us more about it. So over to you, Liz. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Liz. There are emails where it's Liz to Liz, and we get a bit confused which Liz it is. But okay. So what I thought for doing this presentation was to actually discuss some of the rules, a bit like Sound of Music. You know, once you know the notes, you actually know how to progress and how to ask questions about rosé. So that was really the basis behind this presentation. So very quickly, who am I? I'm a Master of Wine. I passed the exam and no one even talked about rosés. So it was really the dark ages. And I live in Southeast France, technically not in Provence, but have worked with Provence wines horrifically since 1987. The books that we've written, and we taste a lot of rosé. At the moment, we're tasting rosés from Provence and rosés from outside of Provence. So we have a massive amount of rosés coming to the house and tasting them all the time. Not all of them are good. A lot of them are very commercial, value for money style rosés, unlike people who write about, I guess, more upmarket regions. We do, I would say, 90% of the rosé we taste is depressing, but we can go on from there. And I saw the Barbie film, probably like a lot of people, and I thought there's actually a lot of similarity between rosé and Ken, in that very nice, very innocuous, and always trying to be something slightly more interesting and something different. And how can you get from the nice guy to something a bit more challenging? How can you move on from facing a wall of identical rosé to finding the one rosé that is really interesting? I should say also that I came to rosé quite late. I came to rosé when I wrote the first book. I never drank rosé before the first book. I was a red wine drinker, and I think my taste in rosé is very influenced by the fact that I was a red wine drinker. I didn't come to rosé as a Sauvignon Blanc drinker or a Chardonnay drinker. I very much like my rosé to have character, a bit of structure, and maybe a bit more weight. So that's my personal preference. And I have talked to a lot of producers who will give me a long story about their reds and a long stories about their whites, but they have no story about their rosé. And if they don't have a story for their rosé, how can we as wine writers or wine promoters or people who work in wine, if the producer doesn't have a story, how can we move that forward as a story? I have to say I don't really necessarily have a full answer, but anyway. So this is a very interesting myth, which a lot of producers get in touch with me about. I spoke to a lot of producers at Provine about this. You are allowed to blend red and white wine to make a rosé if the appellation rules say you are allowed to. You can't do it for a Van de Pey, but Tavel is a red and white wine blend. It's not co-fermented. The Provence appellation does not allow it. So it's the Provence rules that you cannot blend red and white wine. And that is quite an interesting myth, because what it shows is that there are a lot of myths, not just about rosé, but also about red and white wine, which are often repeated. And it took an awful lot of reading through, very, very boring. We've given the link, very, very boring legalese to actually work this out. One reason why Provence was very against the blending of red and white wines is that if it is done badly, it tastes like the blend of a red and white wine. So you have the tannins of the red wine and the fruit of the white wine, and it doesn't always work. But I'm sure many people have tasted Sauvignon Blanc white, a rosé, or Gewürztraminer rosé, or Chardonnay rosé that just has 6% red wine blended in, and it can be lovely. So it's more difficult to make a good wine, but it is legally possible. So this was talking about what are we looking for rosé. So the first column for commercial rosé is what a lot of producers are aiming at making. If you talk to them saying, do you have aspirations to do anything different? They will often say no. If you show a Provence producer a rosé from elsewhere that doesn't taste like this standardized rosé, they can be extremely critical. So that is, I would say, 90% of rosé winemaking is probably that first column. Some countries it will be slightly darker in color, but on the whole, people are looking for that freshness, juiciness, simplicity that will appeal to maybe a younger market or a market that's not looking for complexity. But when we're looking at rosés that are slightly more serious, the color is usually noticeably darker, especially if you're concentrating. Tannins are not a bad word. More oxidative winemaking and reductive winemaking, for me, are two of the biggest differences between the two styles. And ability to age. Ability to age is an interesting thing, which we will come to later, because there are a lot of wines nowadays which are made so well that they will age for a couple of years anyway. So when I'm talking about ability to age, I'm talking about rosés 3 years and older. The first 3 years I regard as a young wine. So this is from a wine merchant, wine merchant, who I don't know, but what I particularly liked about these descriptions is that it's the same person writing the tasting notes, but for 3, 4, 5 different styles of wine. And I've highlighted the words that I think are quite important. So they're all from the 2022 vintage. So what was interesting for Minuti was that It's white fruit, it's white pepper, it's a very white style of wine, which a lot of people like. I didn't highlight citrus and exotic fruit, which I should have done. But it's a very delicate and it's a very light style. And for a lot of people, Chateau Minuti is the benchmark of what a rosé should be. Talk to a lot of producers globally. What rosé are you trying to make? And Chateau Minuti, especially Rose d'Or, is the benchmark. So this is what a lot of people are looking for. Chateau de Sales from Domaine Hôte. It's a very purist winemaker and does tend to have slightly more red fruit, slightly more floral, but very, very neutral, precise, a tiny bit more intense than the Minuti. So I've gone up a slight level of intensity. Chateau Rubin, I always find, I don't know whether it's problems at bottling or oxidative, but it is completely different. It has much more intense flavors. You know, now we're getting the kumquat and the blossom and the red fruits and the minerality, much, much more intense in flavor. The winemaker is not terribly forthcoming to explain why they have more flavor. It is biodynamic, and maybe that has made a difference. Terbrun from Bandol, he is very, very proud of the fact that he has, you can do a vertical in his cellar going back 20 years of his rosé. And again, there's these flavors. I don't know why I didn't highlight everything or it didn't come through. Savory, licorice, pomegranate, spices, much, much more savory, much more concentrated. And finally, a Tavel. And I loved the opening sentence. The colour may shock you. It's a lighter red than a rosé. And we'll come on to Tavel a bit later. But much darker fruit, spiced orange, black cherries, and garrigue. So these are 5 rosés from the south of France, and just showing how, highlighting some of those different fruit flavours and where they're going. So varieties, massively important. A lot of people, I think, forget that white varieties are allowed in a lot of rosé, not in Languedoc really, most of Provence. Wines like Garros are 50% roll. So we're talking about a very pale rosé that is actually half white, half rosé. And the good thing about putting in a white variety is that you can harvest early enough for the acidity and then harvest your black fruit a bit riper so that you've got a balance of fruit and acidity going in there. Just have to be careful which varieties you choose. The Sauvignon Blanc will give that slightly leafy character that a lot of people like. Grenache, very, very popular in the south of France and Spain. People like Gérard Bertrand and Sacha Lachine say it is the only grape that anyone should use to make rosé. And one reason is that you can harvest quite early when the acidity levels are good, but that will already have good sugar levels and a nice round, ripe flavour, but is fairly oxidative and needs to be made in a reductive way to avoid the orange colour. Sanso, very pale, very floral. Increasingly, I dislike 100% Sanso rosé because people concentrate too much on the paleness and the florality, and there's very little depth and complexity. It can be sort of quite one-dimensional, which I don't really like. Zinfandel, right, Meg, maybe you can help at some point later on. I only ever get to taste the Barefoot Blossom Hill style Zinfandel rosés over here, so I'm not too sure if they make any good quality rosé. Cabernet, if it's made well, you can get wonderfully crunchy red fruit and a leafiness. If it's not made well, it can be too much on the leafy character. And Merlot, I think Merlot might be my pet hate for rosé. It's a bit like a donut with a hole in the middle. It's all sort of fruit and floppy, and then it sort of goes in the middle, and unless made beautifully, either with oak or real concentration, it's just floppy. Merlot for me and Rosé doesn't work. Mourvèdre and Syrah are very reductive varieties, and sometimes you get that slightly burnt rubbery character on both of them, which can be a problem for Bandol rosés. I've always thought of Tempranillo being a Rioja rosé character, but I was talking to Rioja producers recently, and they went, "Oh God, no, we don't do Tempranillo. Grenache. Grenache is the variety for rosé historically and now." So I'm sort of adjusting that. Negramaro in Puglia, I think, is a brilliant variety for rosé, lots of acidity. Same with Sangiovese and Blaufränkisch. So all varieties that have lovely ripeness of fruit and good acidity. Important not to forget the Gris varieties, because then you get that blend between skin contact orange wine with lots of texture and not too dark. So can be on its own or part of a blend, creating a bit more perspective on the rosé. And aromatic varieties, coming back to Barbie, a lot of people find the thought of an aromatic variety and muscat to be too girly, which apparently is a negative, which I don't really understand. But if you have an aromatic variety fermented dry in a rosé, I think fabulous. I mean, great food pairing, very attractive, and can have lots of complexity. It's a dry muscat rosé is something I'm increasingly interested in. Elevation and orientation. This is something, I don't know if anyone saw Susan Hume's great article about Gaia a couple of weeks ago, where she tasted wines from his north-facing vineyards compared to the normal vineyards in Piedmont. And it is very interesting. There are a lot of people increasingly looking, especially in hot regions, to north-facing sites, but quite often they're IGP or Van der Pey. So they often get missed out of generic tastings. But getting that north-facing freshness is quite good. And that is quite important when you don't have a lot of altitude. You know, southern France is not known for its high altitude. But elevation is an interesting thing. You get cooler freshness, but you also have greater amount of ultraviolet rays, which results in thicker skins. So you get more concentrated fruit, more phenolics, but greater freshness. So not necessarily good for classic rosé, but that coolness is quite important. So the highest altitude rosé, I tasted this at Provine, was from Tibet, 2,000 meters, which Michael Polly is importing. Worth trying. I mean, it's not the most brilliant of rosés, but as a news feature, 2,000 meter rosé I thought was quite interesting. High altitude rosés at 1,000 meters, Mendoza, southern Lebanon, northern Israel, that hill range, were tasting very well. But actually, I thought the 500 to 1,000 meter range was getting the right balance of fruit and freshness. Rioja, Spain, Greece. And Provence vineyards, I think there's a bit of dispute over who's got the highest vineyards. Does conjure up this wonderful idea of vignerons going out at night with their tape measure to see who's got the highest vineyards. There's a lot of claims to have high vineyards in Provence. And why? It's because of this essential acidity we need in rosé. So whereas with white wine, you can go to extremes to get intensity of fruit and acidity, rosé is slightly different, because if you allow to ripen too late, you can end up with a bit too much alcohol and tannin, which isn't what you want for a classic rosé. So there's this constant juggling if you're making a commercial classic rosé how do you get the acidity in the fruit to balance? If you're making a more complex rosé, so thinking of things like Gerard Bertrand's Clos de Temple, which is €200 a bottle, his alcohol is 14% and plus. He will harvest ripe enough to get the full body, but he also has some white varieties in for that acidity. So how much complexity in the blend is quite important to get the fruit and the acidity. And so they're all looking at very interesting things. And the reason I've put vintage variation there is we were talking about this before we started. The current vintage, I'm not too sure why, but they're balanced to me. There's just no fruit. It's a lot of acidity in the south of France. So questions need to be asked as to how do you keep the fruit and the acidity to make those wines charming. Latitude. Now, this was an interesting, because this is a map which is so out of date. It isn't even that old, and it is from the Wine and Spirits Education Trust. England, you know, you now get good rosé even in Yorkshire, or even some wine in Poland or Sweden. And there are some very good rosés, Slovakia. New Zealand, well, New Zealand's within the limit. So what is interesting is with climate change, we're actually shifting our perspective of where can we get these balanced rosés. So a Provence producer yesterday said to me, he thought in 10 years' time, Provence was no longer going to be able to make the balanced rosé, felt the climate was changing too much. In the Loire Valley, they have traditionally that high amount of sugar in the rosés from Anjou to hide the acidity. But every year the acidity is getting slightly lower, so the sugar is decreasing, but they have a minimum level of sugar on the appellation, 7% for Rosé d'Anjou, 10% for Cabernet d'Anjou. So are they going to have to change the appellation to keep the balance between the acidity and the sugar? So we're actually going through a fair amount of flux at the moment as to how rosé styles are. Benchmark ideas of what a rosé is and where it can be grown is changing quite dramatically. So winemaking. It used to be that you could go around a wine region during harvest time and you'd always be stuck behind a tractor full of fermenting berries, and the air would be full of fermenting wine as you drove around. And then they said machine harvesting, so that you've got spotlights, you can get the grapes in cool. But premium rosés are very often manually harvested, even in the dawn, because people have realized you can put those frontal torches on and still harvest. So if you're harvesting by machine, you can get the grapes, shake the grapes off, and you've just got the grapes coming in. If you're manually harvesting, you're cutting off the bunches. So that's a slight difference, which we'll come to. The most important thing most producers will say, whether it's premium, classic, commercial, whatever, is that the grapes need to be chilled. And one of the important things about chilling the grapes is it keeps them fresh, it stops them from oxidizing, and the colder the grapes, the less color is leached out. So some places like Ott have a giant room, like a freezer, where the case of grapes go in and they're really chilled down, not frozen, but really chilled, which means they can keep the grapes in there and for a couple of days and then press everything together. Crushing and destemming is an interesting thing, because if you've got the stems in, it allows the juice to trickle through in the press. There's a bit more air going on, which allows the juice to come through. Going straight to direct press, keeping it cold and under inert gas, or you can macerate in the press or in a vat for 2 to 20 hours. If you're Tavel, you can macerate for up to a week. The cooler the temperature, the less colour will come through. And something that I will repeat later on, and this is an error that is done quite often, you cannot macerate and then do direct press. You can macerate and then press, but the direct press means you go straight to the press to press with no maceration. And there are a number of wine brochures that I've read in both England and America and France where people will say maceration then direct press. You can't do that. So press, free run juice, first press, second press, the paler for free run and whether you want more substance, or some people saignée. I've put saignée in the second column, but even in very classic Provence style rosé, sometimes 5% saignée can go in just to give a bit of structure. Saignée as in bleeding off a red, or is it bled off the vat? So like Tavel, they don't make red wine, but they do bleed the juice out of the press. Pre-fermentation, cold stabulation, after it's been through the press, you can keep the juice on the must at a very, very low temperature for a couple of days to 2 weeks to extract more body, more flavour. And the pressure is important. So that's sort of really boring technical stuff, but it does show that there is quite a lot of variation. How about the pressing, the pressure that you put on? First press is almost Blanc de Noir. Big question, what is the difference between Blanc de Noir and a pale rosé? Skin contact, which avoids potassium, more expensive presses, the size of the press. If you have a very big press, the grapes may only go through quickly, but it takes a long time for them to get through, so there's more maceration. And the number of bars for the pressure. A lot of producers just press auto and go through. They don't know what the pressure is. So one question is, does direct press mean Provence style? But that is what Provence winemakers do largely. So colour, if you go through historic documents for the last 700 years, it is the colour that everyone talks about. Until the 19th century, the biggest problem was how to keep the beautiful colour to stop it going yellow. Paleness does not equal quality and dry wine, and dark rosé does not mean sweeter. And so this is a photograph of free run juice, first press and second press, and you can see same wine, but just different amounts of pressure will give the colour slightly differently. So what does colour indicate? Basic stuff. I mean, a lot of what I'm saying, everybody already knows. I'm not doing anything radical. I think what I'm just trying to show is that in a simple glass of rosé, there is an awful lot of information that we can extract, stuff that we already know. Cabernet Merlot and Syrah being more pink, Sanso being more white, or there being white grapes. Tavel, what's interesting is it's 70% Grenache, but no one says which Grenache, whether it's black Grenache, white Grenache, or grey Grenache. So you could have a Tavel that is 70% white Grenache plus Claret as a white grape and make a skin contact wine. That's perfectly legal. One thing that I am wondering about the 2023 vintage, have they in Provence, have they harvested too early? The wines are very pale, quite neutral. Carbon filtration is possible in Provence, limited amounts, but people do it. Plus all the other filtration options. It's not always a natural paleness. So Gilles Masson, who's the director of the Rosé Research Centre, did for his thesis, this is part of his colour chart, And when he looks at rosé, he gives every rosé this color, which is how the Rosé Research Centre produces its statistics for wine trends. But it's quite interesting. Personally, I find that sort of pale yellowy color at the top not terribly attractive. Neither do I like the very bluey pink color. And then I think, don't be so stupid. You shouldn't be judging by the color. You should be judging by the taste. But I think we all do. I think we all like the look of a glass of rosé. It always looks pretty. So even though I don't think it necessarily indicates the quality, we do think about it. But not every market thinks the same. This is from 2018 and things have changed quite a bit. But dark rosé has got less and less. But I do notice that when I've been in Spain or Portugal or Greece, or even parts of Italy, the darker rosé is made for more local consumption and paler rosé for export. So the statistics are showing what have been put into the export market, not necessarily what is made, which is sad because everyone then builds up this pale idea and we all become obsessed with the paleness, which is a shame, but it's sort of, there's a lot of commercial pressure. Tannins and alcohol. This is an interesting thing because people say you shouldn't have tannin in rosé, but if I'm having a good rosé that goes with food, I actually quite like a bit of tannin with my rosé. And alcohol, harvesting earlier to have the acidity and the freshness to avoid higher alcohol is something a lot of people are talking about, or adding more Sanso in. But at the same time, linked to the colour and the harvesting, seen a very, very big trend right now of producers making a darker rosé with some tannin and a bit more body, but they're marketing it as a fresh summer red that you could put ice in. I just got an email from Michel Chapoutier saying, do you want to taste our new summer red? Quite a lot of producers are doing that. So there's the Blanc de Noir part of rosé and there is the summer red part of rosé. These are two trends that I'm seeing quite a lot this year. Terminology. So this is cannot do maceration and direct press, knowing that the temperature is kept very low and Tavel has extended maceration. And you can see here the different colors. So the wine on the left was macerated at a cooler temperature and going warmer temperature, more color coming out. Direct press. This direct press was the big thing in the late 1980s when Régine Sumer from Chateau Barberol spoke to a white wine producer in Bordeaux who said, why don't you use this new pneumatic press that we've got that we're using for white wine? And up till then, they'd been making rosé using quite a hard, forceful red wine press. And she said, go home and get 2 bunches of grapes, put one in the blender, and that's the red wine style, and the second bunch of grapes crush slowly in your hand. And the one in your hand is like the pneumatic press, and you get much more delicate juice and less extraction. And that for her was what the difference was between the traditional press and the pneumatic press. Saignée is, again, this is, I have to say, Provence marketing, where they declared that no rosé made with Saignée was a real rosé, which is a bit of a shame because I'm sure a lot of us have had rosé with quite a bit of Saignée in, and it can be quite nice. It's not too much. Too much can be too hard and too tannic and not enough fruit, but it can give a lot of very good structure. One producer who does very, very good Saignée is Lafragge from Bardolino. which I think she's sold by the Wine Society. And she does a very high percentage of Saignée for her rosé. She sleeps next to the press to make sure that it doesn't go too much, but it is a very, very lovely structured, deep-bodied rosé. This I find is the most interesting for me, being geeky. The temperature and how much difference that can make to the final style of the wine. And you know how you get the technical sheets and they say we ferment at this temperature. And I had a revelation last week when a winemaker said there is no way you will be able to ferment at one temperature, even though we have all these computerized controls. In a fermentation tank, it's coldest at the bottom, there's an average in the middle, and as you get higher up, it gets hotter. So the temperature that they ferment at is the average. So you could have the complexity of warm fermentation with some drammy fruit mixed with the slightly colder temperature at the bottom, which is a bit more fresh fruity. Or the other option is not every fermentation tank is programmed at the same temperature, and again you blend. So we are given very simplified information in the technical style, but it is quite nice if you're tasting lots of rosé and you get any of these flavors, you think, okay, this is what they're looking at. Most rosé, I would say, is between 14 to 17. It's safer. If it gets too hot, it can get too bad. I loathe the feel grassy character. So as soon as I smell that, I kind of go, oh, stabulation, cold fermentation. It's just too much for me. But it does appeal to the market that likes Sauvignon Blanc. Yeasts. I don't know if you all remember during COVID, we all got into sourdough bread. I still make sourdough bread. Varies every single time you make the sourdough bread. It comes out slightly different. It can take 36 hours to get going and rising or not, compared with commercial yeast, which is very regular. And it's exactly the same when we're talking about wine. But the important thing for the rosé market is the commercial pressure. So a lot of producers are under pressure to show their rosé to buyers and journalists in January, February, trade shows, March. So you need to have your rosé to have finished its fermentation completely and to have had a couple of months sitting in tank to rest, maybe a bit on the lees, ready to be sold. You also need the fermentation to finish quickly, so you can use the same tanks for your red wine. Saves you having double the amount of tanks. Whereas if you have spontaneous fermentation, there are producers in cooler areas where the fermentation starts off, then it shuts down over Christmas and it restarts in the spring. You can't necessarily guarantee when it's going to finish. You can't necessarily guarantee that Malo isn't going to kick in at some point. Much more variable and much more vintage variation. But personally, I find it a bit more exciting and less of that primary fruit character coming through. Cultivation of yeasts in your own cellar. Oh, yeah. So going back to spontaneous fermentation, I have asked producers who make red and white wine with spontaneous fermentation, what do you do for your rosé? And they say we use cultured yeast because that's our bread and butter wine. So they've got the tank with commercial yeast and then the spontaneous fermentation for the red and the white in the tanks next door, which I think is probably slightly dubious. And a lot of people do cultivate their own yeast using technical people whose names I forget to cultivate the yeast that they have on their grapes. And if you're on a biodynamic vineyard, a very healthy vineyard, you're going to have far more varieties of yeast coming through on your wines, giving complexity. So thiols, these are the things that I said I don't like. And I do tend to give a lower mark when I'm judging rosés with these flavors. They were originally created for to appeal to Sauvignon Blanc drinkers, with all the various things that can increase it. I know winemakers that age their rosé on Sauvignon Blanc lees, and of course there's the Sauvignon Blanc rosés from New Zealand. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed up a bit. How often do any of us do a vertical of rosés? Very, very interesting tasting to be able to do, to see how a wine ages and what characters we should look for. The oldest rosé I've had was 1959, Cabernet d'Anjou, and Provence rosé back to 1990. Beautiful tasting, not old at all. And this PowerPoint will be ready for people to see. So I think you can look at all these details later. Grand Reserve Rosé is 10 to 12 years old. Garras releases about a year later, but doesn't ever show older vintages, which is quite interesting. Reductive versus oxidative. The oxidative winemaking using barrels or amphora, or just something that allows a bit more oxygen in, but not meaning that the wine is oxidized. I have seen the wrong word being used. The different sorts of wood. This is quite interesting. Acacia is a fast growing trend for aging rosé. Chateau Saint Martin in Provence also uses mulberry from their orchards. Oaked rosé, some people hate it. Most Provence producers hate it. Garras was not the first. I think Rioja and Ribera del Duero were probably the first. Most people think Bandol and Tavel are oaked. Almost none are. Some oak is very obvious and some is very invisible. So oaked rosé is an interesting category. And again, the porosity of cement, amphoras, jars. Malolactic, it does happen, especially if there isn't a lot of malic acid already in the wine. So it's only a small amount that goes through malolactic. Closibon and Venom from South Africa both use flor, but they are not made as sherry, which I have seen repeatedly. It's just that a bit of flor gets into the wine, into the barrel, and gives it a slightly more oxidative character. So the big question is, are we looking for a technical rosé or a taste of terroir? Should we be able to taste the terroir? If we did a blind tasting, would you be able to tell in the same way that we often can with a red and white wine where it comes from? I think you should. That is what I would be looking for. And as I've said, the next trend, Blanc de Noir or summer reds. Well worth looking out for these two trends. And my rosé lifestyle, I live up in the mountains. We can put rosé in the snow. We can eat out in the garden. And there's a picture of Ben. We went hiking and he's got rosé in a can. We're not always by the beach. I only put in Whispering Angel by the beach to be confrontational, I suppose. But that's not normally my lifestyle. Please don't serve rosé too cold. Kills all flavour. And that's it. And those are the two books. I shall now stop sharing and see if there are any questions. Oh my God, yeah. I'm glad it's wet in Bad Honnef. So, if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Liz, for a very in-depth talk and look into rosé. There's a lot of talk there. A lot of them people attending are sort of saying various countries that they've enjoyed rosés from. A Pinot Noir rosé in the West Coast and also in Oregon. And Rebecca Milestein was saying Turley makes a good white Zinfandel, not the easiest to find in the States. And Meg was saying there's some great Zin rosés. Sorry, we don't get enough good stuff in Europe. It's got nice spicy.
Definitely impossible to get here, I think. I see one question about Syrah bean amylic. It's it can have that sort of boiled sweet, creamy. I don't find it smells of wine. It just smells of that creamy boiled sweet. It's a bit like that rhubarb and custard boiled sweet that my kids love, and I think it's awful.
There was one question about where I think you can find Susan Hume's article about north-facing vineyards. We
I
can
think it was in, well, is it World of Fine Wine or Decanter? I did post it on LinkedIn. I can have a look and I can send it to you, Anne Vies. It was a very interesting one. Simpson Winery, is that the English vineyard?
Yes, I believe.
So I have had problems with some English rosé in that they overdo the dumbing down the fruit. And I think one of the joys about English rosé is that it is just so full of joy and fruit, and what a shame to dumb it down. And it can be very, very interesting. Am I seeing a shift in the bottling of rosé from clear to darker bottles? This is, I actually wrote an article about this for Clubbo. When we did our tasting, 10% of the wines submitted to the premium rosé tasting were in dark bottles, but 30% of the wines that got a high score were in dark bottles. So for me, it is very much an indication of quality. If I'm talking to producers about light strike, they sort of go, oh, well, we don't have light strike. And I say, well, 30% of my tastings suffer from light strike. Rosé does have light strike. Sparkling rosé has light strike. You should put it in dark bottles. And they go, no, we don't have that problem. And then I go, but it's much more sustainable if you put your rosé in dark bottles. And they go, oh, well, that's a message we can tell our customers. That's a positive message, whereas light strike is a negative message. So there are more people talking about dark bottles, not fast enough, and far more people need to do it. Galipé fought Moët & Chandon to put Galipé Rosé in dark bottles. It was a big battle. And I think far more people need to be vocal about that. There was another good, I'm just going through the questions. Tondonia Rosé. So what's interesting about Tondonia, this is all marketing, in that Tondonia, I think, is an absolutely fantastic rosé, but their Grand Reserva is not a unique thing. It is something that a few people do in Rioja, and it is worthwhile looking out for it. I love this idea of a Grand Reserva and a Reserva style, because it gives an indication to the consumer what sort of wine they're looking for and what sort of aging. I think it would be great if Provence Rosé said this is a Reserva or a Grand Reserva, this is aged in oak, this is a longer aged wine. I think it's a wonderful indication to the consumer of what there is. Burgundy roses such as Marsanne, I love them, but sadly, apparently the producers are making less and less because nobody is buying it. Possibly too expensive, not marketed. They get more money for their red than their white. Sense of economics, you can probably get far more money for a red Pinot Noir from Burgundy than a rosé Pinot Noir. So that is very much economics. There's a lot of complaints about the €200 Clos de Temple. It does sell. There is a market who will want that. Simpsons is pure Meunier, yes. You mentioned a bit about alcohol imbalance in Provence Rosé. So I've had rosés where the alcohol is, I think 14 is probably my acceptable limit, but I have had rosés that have been 15. If the wine is well made and has enough extract, you won't notice that alcohol, as with reds and whites. But you cannot have higher alcohol and try and make a pale, light elegant rosé. You know, it's sort of, it's like putting two bits of a puzzle together and it doesn't work. So if you're going to southern Italy or southern Spain, where they've got a bit more maceration and a bit more guts and body, it can take the higher alcohol. So it's not the alcohol itself that's the problem for me. It's trying to make a light pale rosé at the same time as having the alcohol. It just doesn't work. Marsanne rosé is very difficult to find, yeah, which is a real shame. So it's a bit of a catch-22. There are producers who say we can't sell our wine. But just tasted a Provence producer who made a fantastic rosé, made it for the first time last year. So I went to see them yesterday and I said, can I taste the new vintage? And they said, oh no, we've stopped making it. I said, you only made one vintage? Couldn't sell it. I said, so you think 1 year is what you need to get a wine on the market? What were you looking for to sell a wine? Which is one reason why I started off this presentation saying, if we're writing or selling rosé, what is our story? It's exactly the same as the alcohol and the pale rosé. You cannot sell rosé saying it's light and it's fresh and it's just Ken and you have it by the pool. But we also want to make a nice complex rosé, but we're telling you the story of the poolside rosé. You know, it's have that message going all the way through is really, really important. So what can we do when we're tasting rosé and extract information to understand what it is in our glass? That is something that, you know, I've been tasting rosés almost, feels awful, almost solidly for like 8 years now. And I'm still learning, still understanding. So we did this 2023 Provence rosé tasting last week. And I said, I'm getting no color, no fruit, high acidity, but I'm getting this really weird malolactic creaminess mid-palate, which is at odds with the rest of the wine. And we had a winemaker with us, and he was saying that one of the problems is, am I going to get this one right, is that the energy in the wines, that they, you know, people put a lot of enzymes in to get the fermentation going, and it just triggers off the malolactic, and that gets going. And there's increasingly uncontrolled malolactic happening mid-fermentation. So they can't stop it because the fermentation is happening, but they also have the malolactic. So there is this ongoing tension there. Which is great. Why do I think it took so long for winemakers and consumers to see rosé as a serious category? I think because the big surge in rosé success initially was, so if you're talking about 2002, 2003, which was when the surge started, nobody was paying a lot of attention to marketing rosé, but there was an awful lot of lifestyle. So I've done a study of the marketing for Provence rosé, and you can see it starts off as being terroir, good with food, and then at about the same time that Instagram comes through, 2010, 2011, sudden surge in lifestyle, dramatic change in marketing. And how can you market something as serious when you're selling a dream? Which is the big argument. I don't know how many people have been following the discussion on LinkedIn recently about why we shouldn't have masterclasses and we shouldn't have technical discussion about wine because nobody wants to know. All people want to know is the wine fun? Does it taste good? Nobody wants to know details. And here I am watching people listening, hopefully not falling asleep. Going, yeah, we do want to know, because how can we appreciate that wine without knowing what's going on? because we're the people communicating, we're the people selling the product. And I think rosé producers have not, they are following the dream, they are following a commercial recipe. They are not convinced by the story and by the technical background. And as I said, until they will do, because there is a commercial crisis at the moment. People are not buying as much rosé as they did buy. They are looking at higher quality. They are not buying the cheap and cheerful. It's going to force a change. In some respects, an economic recession is brilliant because it forces people to actually get off their complacent marketing stool of we can sell any rubbish. And actually, we do want quality. And if we're going to spend that sort of money, if you're going to spend $15 or $20, pounds, whatever, you want value for money. It's not enough to just buy the dream. Personally, I do not like Whispering Angel, but I have to admit it is consistently relatively good quality. It's not the most exciting, but you can guarantee that you're going to get a certain level, which is not the same for all of them. But is it leading you onto something more exciting? Does that answer the question?
Yes.
Yep. Food pairing is the way forward for marketing rosé. I don't know if anyone follows the Tavel appellation on Instagram. So last Monday, they did a post of an auction of a 1964 Tavel. I went, oh, fantastic. That sounds really exciting. And they said, the auctioneers recommend this is drunk with sushi. And I replied and I went, no, come on. And they went, you fell for it. It's 1st of April. So, what food do you match with rosé? Do you want, and I'm being sort of an agent provocateur here, are we looking for a wine that is simple and neutral, that doesn't fight with the food, that is just the liquid refreshment that will help ease grilled fish, salad, or anything? Or are we looking for a rosé or a white or a red that has complementary flavors? And that is an interesting thing. So for those of you in London, I'm doing a premium rosé event on the 19th of June. And we've just got a quote from Eric Zwiebel, Master Sommelier. Can you tell me what is the best way as a sommelier to market rosé? And he said most sommeliers know nothing about rosé. They will sell Minuti or Whispering Angel because it's an easy sell. And he said back labels on rosé very rarely give any individual food matching. They'll give a generic rosé is good with, which was an interesting point. I don't often look at back labels for food matching, but might be an interesting thing to actually do a sort of mental tally. How many rosés actually put on their back label, this is made in a guideline to how you make a rosé, and does it match with food? I just don't know. I mean, I've not really thought about it before, but I ought to do a tally with every rosé I taste. Do people actually say anything about the food and wine matching? Please don't put salad niçoise. Just so many people put salad niçoise with rosé or sushi. So I understand rosé.
I think we've reached our time limit, unfortunately, though the discussion could go on for ages and ages and ages. So maybe we can carry on, sort of people stay on, but I think we ought to close the formal session now with a huge thank you to you for absolutely fascinating, just so much information. And please, can we have the presentation, because there was so much there which we can't all take in and remember.
Okay, I will send that on.
Thank you very, very much indeed. We should be seeing you again. Sorry, my I just got a message on my computer that the battery is dying. But we hopefully will be seeing you again.
29th of May.
29th of May for Let's Taste on Maremma Rosés. So that should be really interesting. Details of that will be going out in a little while. And we hope we'll look forward to seeing you then. And our next Let's Talk is in 2 weeks' time, when we've got 3 people from Porto Protocol who've been involved in bottle reuse and the massive experiment from the London Wine Fair last year. They'll be telling us about the results of that, so that'll be really interesting. So Elizabeth, thank you so much. And as you can see by the large number of people here, it was much appreciated.